Hey everyone, this is Tom Silemy of Device Talks. I apologize if I maxed out the memory on your phone. I know this podcast is huge. It's kind of like a white paper for your ears, but we have lots of great insights on pulse field ablation. We'll speak with Steve Mickelsen, the founder of Farapulse, and now the Chief Translational Science Officer at Acutus. We'll talk about how he came to develop this technology. Really cool story. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. Then I'll connect with Ken Stein. Ken is the Senior Vice President at Boston Scientific. He's also CMO for cardiac rhythm management. He'll talk about where Farapulse is headed. He also offers some insights on how he views the role of CMO. Very cool comments about cynicism and about how he views his role in the healthcare experience. And finally, we'll have a very short excerpt right in between those two big interviews with Rebecca Seidel. She's president of Cardiac Ablation Solutions at Medtronic. We'll hear about their pulse field ablation program and also hear from Dr. Robert Cowell. He's a CMO at Medtronic's CR business. So lots of great stuff. This is sort of a model of where we're headed. We're going to try to focus on single subjects with each podcast episode and bring you many, many different perspectives. So let's go. All right, you ready for this?
Ready.
Well, Chris Newmarker is unavailable for this week's podcast. He's back from vacation, but he's got some child care demands that are keeping him busy. Much more important than talking about medical devices. But I'm thrilled to have with us two members of our most excellent team, Danielle Kirsch, Senior Editor of Life Sciences, and Sean Hooley, Associate Editor of Life Sciences. Danielle and Sean, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Same. Yeah. Thanks.
It's good to have your
couldn't think of something more creative to come up with there.
That was excellent, Sean. That's all you got to say. But so you guys really sort of put together or at least wrote the articles for this week's Newmarker's Newsmaker. So we'll run them down and sort of have you lead the conversation for each of them. But I know before we get into the news of the week, people are really going to want to understand, Danielle, what is the status of local medtech cult hero, Barry the Groundhog?
Well, I haven't really had any Barry sightings or Petunia, his child.
That's right. I forgot. Barry had adopted and or acquired an offspring from someplace. Yes.
Yeah, I actually told somebody else about how Barry showed me his child, and they said, did he come out and hold the child up like Lion King? And I was like, no. But yeah, I haven't really seen Barry lately. I've been telling people don't look up the lifespan of a groundhog because you don't want to know. You
don't want to know. So no idea if Barry ran into Carl the Coyote or Ricky the Range Rover or anything like that?
I don't think so. I just think I've been out in the yard a little too much and maybe upset his routine. But
okay.
The pears on my pear tree are starting to fall to the ground. So maybe he'll sniff them out and come fatten up before he goes to sleep for the winter.
Barry does like those pears, if I recall.
Yes.
All right. Well, the moment you see Barry, please, we'll have you back in the podcast and put everyone's mind at ease.
Of course.
So let's roll into this week's Newmarker's Newsmakers. Sean Hooley, you are author of number 5. Bring it home, man.
Ultrahuman raises $17.5 million in a Series B financing for its wearable glucose monitoring tech. From what I understand, Ultrahuman is a platform for sort of fitness tracking, but they've made a foray into metabolic tracking now, and they're helping people with diabetes track blood glucose in real time in an effort to optimize diet and exercise. And evidently it's a very popular platform because it was really a lot of people were interested in this story.
All right, well, great news in the glucose and diabetes space. We'll roll on to number 4. I actually wrote this one up. We don't have any metrics as to how popular it was, but it certainly is big news. J&J announced that Alex Gorski will hand over the CEO role to Joaquin Duato. He is currently the company's vice chair of the executive committee. and he'll take over as CEO in the new year. The release cites family health reasons for Alex Gorski's stepping down as CEO. He will be named executive chairman, and from the tone of the release, it's expected he'll still be involved with management, but also J&J's pretty emphatically stating that Joaquin Duato will be CEO and sort of is next in line. This isn't just sort of a shifting of titles. It sounds as if he'll be certainly taking over. So not a lot of, I don't know if you guys have any insights in this. I've read a few analyst reports on this, and people seem to accept it as a positive move. And one that doesn't look like as if it's going to really change things very much. It seems like Joaquin Duato was seen as a possible successor. So not a lot of surprise coming from Wall Street analysts.
It definitely is out of the blue. I mean, not that I'm necessarily tuned in to Johnson & Johnson's personnel situation, but sometimes you hear kind of rumblings, or that's a planned transition or something. But it seems like the reaction to this is pretty tame. So
no, absolutely, and they cited health reasons twice in the release. So hopefully, whatever the situation is, it works out for the best. Dr. Stephen Mickelsen, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, hi. How you doing?
Doing great. Great to have you on the podcast. I understand this is your first one, and I promise it'll be a great time. So, and you got a great story to tell, so it's going to be super duper easy. I want to talk about your work at Acutus a little later on, but I always open up these interviews trying to understand sort of people's origin stories. Let's get a little bit into your background. How did you decide to move into medicine? I understand from our just initial conversation when we started that you didn't go directly to medical school after high school or college.
Yeah, no, actually I'm a high school dropout and decided to pursue a music career. Somehow got a day job in a hospital. And so for a period of my early, from late teens to early 20s, I spent, a long time, working in the hospital and then taking months off to tour and, record albums. And I had 2 old bands. At some point, I just started loving my day job more. I kind of got promoted into working in the cath lab, all kind of on the job training. This is stuff you cannot do anymore. But ended up working with a guy named Fred Kuzumoto, who is my mentor. He taught me everything I know about EP, and we started publishing papers. I got excited. I was looking at this, this evolving area of medicine, and everything about it was mysterious and exciting, and it was moving so fast and of great interest. So I decided at the age of 29 to start college, undergrad, and
that's outstanding. So you were publishing papers and such when you were, or at least had your names on papers, and you hadn't even had the high school or college diploma at that point.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
And then I went to undergraduate college and quit my job as a musician and focused on trying to get good enough grades so I could get into medical school.
How do you at 29 sort of decide, okay, I'm completely getting off this track and getting onto that one? Was it a difficult sort of commitment to make, or did it seem super simple? Being a musician is very hard. It's full-time work. We did get signed. We had some music charted on the college rock charts, and we got to tour a little bit. But and I was at a great kind of juncture in the career where I could have kind of pursued it, but I just absolutely fell in love with the technology and the mystery of arrhythmias, and it had a lot to do with working with a guy like Fred Kuzumoto, who, respects everyone around him and really tries to raise people up. And I just happened to be there, and he taught me everything. So, but you can't practice no matter how much you learn. You're just not allowed to practice unless you go to school. Sure. Well, I want to get into the medical career in a minute, but I'm sure people are wondering what was the name of your band and what was your instrument?
I had 2 bands. Well, the one that got signed was called the Bellyachers. It's a little bit hard to find because in the early 90s, everything was still like cassette tapes and discs. CDs were kind of new even.
I remember.
and there's a current band called the Bellyacres. You can find them easy out of Austin, Texas. Great band. But that was the name of the band. We were part of Core Records. And then, and that was part of Paramount Pictures. And then the other band was called Venus Diablo. And again, there's a modern band that's kind of like a death rock band, but ours was more like beatnik, alt rock, with a saxophone player, a lot of velvet, and we all had to wear ties.
Very cool. I'm sure I would have enjoyed it. And what was your instrument? What'd you play?
I sang and play guitar.
Okay. I was going to say you have a great voice for podcasts. So I was hoping you were at least had access to a microphone. Are you still playing in a band at all?
Very rarely play my instruments. I do for my daughters, and occasionally for my wife, but
good use of the skills. So, well, let's fast forward then. So you went to college and went to medical school. Were you intent upon the whole time going into electrophysiology or? Yep. So
I had one goal. The only one reason I was there was to go to electrophysiology. I explored a few other things, but I continued to be quite involved and focused on being an electrophysiologist.
Fascinating. And let's fast forward a little more, where you were practicing, and somewhere along the line you came up or helped to develop the idea that became Farapulse. Ultimately, I'm always intrigued by a physician who sees a need and has the aptitude to sort of build a better mousetrap, because you didn't have a biomedical background. You're not an engineer. Talk us. Give us the story about that. How did that all come together?
Well, kind of growing up like I did, my dad had a shop, and so we could build anything that we wanted growing up. You know, he had tools, and we would steal them, and he'd encourage us to be creative. But when I got to college, I was so focused on electrophysiology. I ended up going to the NIH for a year, doing some innovative, inventing some things and trying to develop new procedures. I'd been a member of what is the Heart Rhythm Society, NASP, since 1994, I think.
Wow.
And and so I got to see the evolution of the technologies, and I was fascinated with that, like that interface between, developing new things, new procedures, new technologies. That's really what drove me into electrophysiology. Fascinating area, great mentor, very motivated, plus this exciting opportunity for the nexus between, man-made objects and and human problems. And so when I got to medical school, I had, I went to the University of New Mexico, went to Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville for my internal medicine. But when I applied for cardiology, finally, after a decade, after my decision, I got picked up. I went to the University of Iowa, where, in the interview, they offered me a spot outside the match, which, I don't know, most people won't even understand how doctors get from point A to point B. But and part of the deal was I get to have a little bit of dedicated time to do research. So, and for me, research is play. Like, I want to play. I want to play with devices and technology and procedures and try to make it better. And so when I got there, they gave me some dedicated time. I sent a whole bunch of invention disclosures and applications for internal grants. And I ended up getting one. And it was for the technology that ended up being Farapulse. What happened in my mind is atrial fibrillation in 1993. We didn't think we were ever going to really ablate it. It was a chaotic rhythm, couldn't map it very well. And the idea of ablating it was a little bit foreign. We knew that it was possible to do surgeries to address it. And some people started looking at ways of doing it. That's Pierre and Hasseguer. They looked at drivers, things that start the AFib. And when they published that data, I was actually at the NASP meeting, and I was really impressed with it. Over the course of my training, like going to undergrad and all that stuff, I'm watching the story unfold. Pulmonary vein isolation becomes the preeminent approach with radiofrequency ablation, but it comes at a cost. There's a lot of safety issues, and AFib is basically a nuisance problem for most people who have it. It doesn't tend to shorten your life unless you have other problems with it. So this idea of, the risk to benefit ratio for AFib ablation is, it's not very wide, and so anything we can do to increase safety. So I looked at the problem and I created a chart. I said, where are the big limitations? If we could go back knowing that it's possible to ablate AFib and we could start over, would we develop an RF catheter and go around the pulmonary veins, or would we do something different? Mm-hmm. Would we use RF? Would we use cryo? Would we use X-rays? Would we use diphtheria toxin? I don't know. And so I created a big chart, started knocking off all the things that are good and bad and how to address them, and came up with a procedure, filed the patent, and electroporation just rose to the top as being the absolute best energy source.
Yeah. Talk to me about the difference between the standard and what you developed with Farapulse.
The inspiration came from a safety move. So radio frequency ablation, which is the standard of care, is very flexible platform. But electroporation works incredibly fast. It's minimal heat. I did not invent electroporation. In fact, electroporation, as far as I can tell, started in 1867.
Wow.
So in this kind of late Victorian era where people were exploring electricity, people started exploring a thing called fulguration. And fulguration is high voltage sparking, and they would use it for surface lesions. And so I looked at all that data. Electroporation, the term was coined in as a laboratory technique for fusing cells and for doing gene therapy and other technologies. And it was relatively developed, but as a therapeutic or as a ablation technology, electroporation was first applied really either as this technology fulguration or in the heart and catheter ablation. The very first human catheter ablation was done with electroporation, DC ablation. 1980, Mel Scheinman, and then a number of other people kind of quickly followed and transformed electrophysiology from being a primarily diagnostic specialty into being an interventional specialty. But electroporation had problems, mostly that you had to keep your patients under general anesthesia. And there are a number of other things. Some great engineers had already solved most of these problems by the mid-90s. This guy, Boyd and Cunningham out of London, they actually created the first microsecond pulse generator. So they called it low energy DC ablation. But it was 1985 or 86. It became commercially available. So you could do what is basically modern pulse field ablation back in the late 80s. But the first RF ablation was in 1986, and every hospital already had an RF generator. So when people realized they could just use RF, boom, it really became the preeminent way because you could do it in an awake patient. And it's a little hard to do kind of traditional PFA in an awake patient. Fast forward, all the advantages of PFA were very clear to me, and tissue healing and all that stuff. So I pursued that with the Iowa approach. And so I started the company because after filing a patent, the university asked me to start a company and then license it back. And I thought it was reasonable to do. So I started the company and wrote some grants to the government, never got them, SBIR grants. They were scored well, but didn't make funding. But I was able to raise, with the help of John Slump and a number of other people, able to raise some money to drive the early business. We got the interest of Boston Scientific pretty early on. How
did you do that? How did you bring them in?
Well, I was at a heart rhythm meeting, and I was doing elevator pitches.
That's what you got to do.
Elevator pitch competitions. In fact, Iowa Approach got some awards at the Rice Business School competition.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'm an EP doctor, so they would sit me down and listen to me. I was actually a fellow in training at the time, actually, so I sat down and showed it to Medtronic, showed it to Biosense Webster, showed it to Boston Scientific, showed it to AtriCure, showed it to everyone. and see if they were interested in it. And what I had the first time I showed it off was really preliminary, acute animal studies showing the tissue. I tried to explain the history, explain the rationale, and it was an epicardial approach because I wanted to stay out of the left atrium altogether. Although, I had developed endocardial catheters as well, but the primary approach was one that was going to be epicardial so that you didn't have to heparinize your patient.
Okay.
And that was the early development, first animal study that so I built my own pulse generator, and I soldered together a multiplexer, 30 channel multiplexer, designed a catheter and built that catheter, built all the rigs for it, all this stuff for like $40,000. And then raised some money to do a chronic animal study because one of the guys I talked to at one of the big companies said, "Hey, this is great, but I don't believe anything unless you do a chronic animal study." So we raised a little bit more money, got that. That was actually supported by the state of Iowa. So they gave us a loan to do this work. And at that time, I had met a number of people. I formed a formal board, turned it into a C Corp, and I knew that I had to bring on real professionals. So I brought on, some professional engineering talent and hired a real CEO, and that's Alan Zingler. He's the head of the company. Alan wasn't even the CEO of the company. He was just I invited him to see the first time I ever fired it off incomplete, the whole system working as a unit. And I invited Boston Scientific. So I had fired it off in pieces and done other things, but this was my first foray into medical device engineering. And I fired off the sequence and it worked. And it was quite exciting for me. And then the chronic animal studies looked incredibly good. Mm-hmm. And then that drove investment.
How confident were you during all of this that you were doing things correctly and that things were working out?
Well, I had a small team, so I blew up a lot of stuff building it. It's incredibly dangerous. Now that I actually know a lot more about what I was doing, I realized how incredible it could have been. It could have been. I was working alone in a dark room with a capacitor bank that had 8,000 joules in it. I was like, oh my God. So I was ignorant enough not to know that I couldn't do it. Is probably the reality. I remember talking to an engineer who had worked on a competitive company's project, and he said that there's no way to do what I did because if you go to the specs on just wires, to do 100 amp wire, the specs on that, you need at least a 14 gauge wire with a huge insulator and all that. I didn't bother to do it that way. I just built the catheter, and then I decided the peak voltage will be whatever it could handle. Mm-hmm. And then I empirically tested it and found if you have microsecond pulses, they hold up a lot better than you would think. And so I kind of figured out a 38 gauge wire was fine. So
amazing. So
it's accidental.
Boston Scientific came on as an investor. They obtained a right to acquire the company, which they did recently. We're going to talk to Ken Stein later in the podcast about sort of where we go from here. What was how long did you remain with the company after that, and did it sort of become something beyond? Obviously, it became something beyond a project. Was it? How long did you work there, and when did it sort of become? When did you move away from that and move on to your next thing, or at least not having a thing for a while, perhaps?
Yeah. So after I hired Alan Zingler to take my position as the CEO, because prior to hiring him, I wasn't just the CEO. I was also the head janitor, and we really only had like one real full-time employee at this point, and we had a lot of consultants. I think Alan Zingler was, in full-time employee number 2 even. Wow. I was a full-time employee number 3. So after 2 years of work, we transformed the company quite a bit. And with the interest in investment, we're able to raise, a lot more money from angel investors. And I stayed on officially for probably another 18 months after that. because, after 18 years of training, I was just about to start my academic career. And, I couldn't not take care of patients. And this company required a real CEO to drive confidence so that we could drive legitimate investment.
So this was all over 4 years. You started January 2012, left February 2016.
Yeah, something like that. It actually started in 2011.
Okay.
It wasn't a C Corp until 2012.
You're still practicing medicine, but have you gone on to start other companies? I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile. I see Needle Eye Medical. I see Cardionomic, where you're a technical consultant. It sounds like you've got the sort of entrepreneur bug.
Yeah, no, I started a second company, Needle Eye, as a startup. It's a vascular access tool, uses a ultrasound probe that is on a stylus that goes into an access needle. Mm-hmm. That way you can see what's right using M mode echo. You can see what's right in front of the needle as you advance it in. And it's because I've witnessed a number of complications in my years of being in the hospital that are avoidable if you could see what you're pushing the needle into. If you're doing a spinal tap, or if you're doing a subclavian stick or some areas of the body that are very hard to use ultrasound guided, that's one way you can get ultrasound to show you where you want to go. That company is in flux at the moment because it's a commodity item, and it's in the medtech world is really focused on VC investment into high margin devices.
Mm-hmm. And then in November 2020, you joined Acutus Medical as chief translational science officer. That's easier to say than I just did. Compare what Acutus Medical is doing to what you did with Farapulse. Is it the same technology? Is it a variation of the technology? Is it sort of a next generation? How does it stack up?
After leaving Farapulse, aka IO Approach, I had a non-compete. And so I just went to my lab at the University of Iowa and built a series of experiments to better understand how to apply electroporation as a ablation technology and as a gene therapy technology or a electrochemotherapy technology. And it's so I spent a lot of years with hamster cells and Jello, kind of looking at waveforms and the major determinants, knowing that I was going to, because I'd invested so much in being a world expert in electroporation, neuromodulation being my other thing that I am deeply involved with. And we could talk about that another time because cardionomic's worth talking about. But so I get out of my non-compete, which is quite long. And and so I start talking to a lot of the companies. A lot of the big companies are interested in hiring me as a consultant. And so I dabble with that for a little while. But I started spending more time with Acutus as a consultant because they have really fascinating mapping system. And they were very interested in building a pulse field system. And so I decided to go with a company that was at a great stage for a person like me. The highly organized companies, they're so structured that they really impede their ability to operate in a very quickly innovative way. Big companies are good at acquiring companies. They're good at marketing. They're good at running large clinical trials, distribution, vertical integration. They're not necessarily good at championing really radical ideas. And so, whereas Acutus is, you see, if you could look behind the screen, they have amazing stuff. And I was really impressed. And they were willing to entertain my interest in electroporation in a way that would allow me to do something I think people will be happy with. So a big challenge that we have is, when you have pulse field, if you want to, kind of direct the electricity in a way, create a field that you can predict, or you can get a focal catheter to work. You have fixed geometry, what waveform works best. And you can get a bunch of guys. There's probably 20 people that you can get in a room right now that would, they could argue for weeks about, what is the best waveform, biphasic, monophasic, do you do unipolar, do you do bipolar, do you do this, X, Y, and Z? And so there's so many variables with electroporation that you can kind of knobs to turn that it becomes very hard to compare between what everyone is doing. In the end, there's some very basic things. And so I discuss with Acutus what their goals were, and our goals aligned very well. Mm-hmm. And so really accelerate the project, and it started, getting ready for human trials. And I'm very happy with the results that we have right now. It's non-thermal, and it seems to be tolerable for patients and very, very effective at creating lesions.
So you were, when the Farapulse acquisition by Boston Scientific was announced, and there was a post on LinkedIn, and I think you had made the comment that this was their biggest acquisition since Watchmen. There's a lot of other praise of the acquisition, that it really promises big things are coming. Where is this field headed, both with now Boston Scientific putting its full force behind Farapulse and your work at Acutus Medical? What does this field look like in 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think people use the term paradigm shifts frequently. Mm-hmm. But I think this is a great example of when a real paradigm shift is happening. There's enough data now to support electroporation as a safer, faster, easy mode to use for certain applications in the heart. And so Farapulse is already in the European market. Everybody else is fast follower, and that list is pretty long if you look at the data being generated from and published in every one of these meetings. I would say a good 10% of the meeting content of HRS may have been related to pulse field in some regard. Where's it going is a very good question, though, because there are still challenges to deploying the technology, and I think we will see a convergence of strategy happening over the next 2 to 3 years. And when I say convergence of strategy, since there are so many knobs you can turn with electroporation, I think you'll start seeing that everyone kind of converges in one direction on their single shot devices, what works the best, what's easy, because it's not necessarily electroporation that makes the workflow for a doctor that elegant. I mean, electroporation is great for tissue healing. It's great for speed, ease of use, maybe, but that also depends on the shape of the catheter, how easy it is to put up into the body, how big the hole is. Are there complications that we see from electroporation that we haven't really had to deal with in the past that we have to overcome or mitigate? And there are a lot of unknown questions, but I would just say that convergence is something I would expect to see, and wherever, and because you have a lot of strategies right now, and some of them look a lot different than the other. The Farapulse flower versus a ring catheter versus a balloon catheter, I think, or a mesh. You'll see that. And then there's the big strategy between a focal catheter and a single shot catheter for PVI. Mm-hmm. I think focal is definitely going to be the preeminent technology, because like designing a bicycle, EPs have been using a deflectable, pointable catheter for a long time, and we can use it to ablate VT, PVCs, AVNRT, flutter, fib, whatever you want to ablate. We can do it with that catheter. We know how to do it. And it's a highly refined technology. And it's really hard to get away from something that really kind of, works. It just simply works. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is going to ascend into the preeminent kind of application for pulse field, whereas single shot's very, very valuable area, because, if you do it right, if you design it so that it empirically has enough overlap and redundancy and can address the variation in human anatomy, it's a great tool, very fast, very effective, since PVI is currently the cornerstone of AFib ablation for paroxysmal AFib. that is a good strategy. And I think so. Those will be the two converging strategies. I think everyone's going to have a focal catheter and everyone is going to have a single shot. And I don't know what the single shot's going to look like. I got my own personal beliefs, but I can't share those with you right now. But I do see, I love what Farapulse has done. Obviously multiplexing is a really important component. But we'll see how many people really follow that lead.
And final question: as you make this, as this makes the procedure safer, I assume the intention and the hope is that it's going to open the opportunity for many more patients to be treated this way.
Oh my God, yeah. So if you look at let's say you believe epidemiologists, you got about a 1% incidence and prevalence of AFib in the population. You got 300 million people here, and that's going to be 3 million people per year going to need an ablation. So if you're going to and then of those people, 20 or 30% need 2 ablations. Right now, we don't touch that. We don't even come close to doing that many primary ablations. And if you look at Europe and all the other ones, we're really under-resourced to be able to address anything outside of paroxysmal, and then between the redos and all that stuff. So a technology that hastens the workflow and increases safety is absolutely critical to taking care of more patients. What I really like about what's happening right now is, I'm obviously a believer in electroporation in this application. I think it is a perfect technology, and I've been a proponent of it for many years. But the cool thing in my mind is that with real pulse field ablation, where it's not very thermal, you're not actually cooking too much tissue and you're on the posterior wall, those kind of things. When this increases safety, tissue healing, all this universally for the field of electrophysiology. So treating AFib, regardless of what company you're a supporter of, since every single company is working on this and pouring enormous, and I'm telling you, billions of dollars are being spent on this right now. It's shocking. I think clinical outcomes are going to improve. And I think that is an inevitable consequence of the willingness of people to kind of reevaluate whether or not RF is really as good as we think it is. And I think, in 5 years from now, I'll be very surprised if there are a lot of procedures done with RF. I think probably the only one I would see sticking around would be something like if somebody wants to do gangliectomies, or if they want to do a AVNRT, those types of arrhythmias. That's probably the last bastion of RF, because pulse field can. My experience is we've been able to do pulse field for every other type of procedure done by an EP.
Fantastic. Well, great story, great outcome, and grateful that you joined us on the podcast, Steve. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I had a lot of fun, Tom.
All right, let's roll on to number 3. This is another one written by you, Sean. So bring us up to date.
ResMed launches next generation positive airway pressure PAP device, the AirSense 11. It's got new features like personal therapy assistant and care check-in, which offer tailored guidance to users and help them ease into therapy and nightly use for treating obstructive sleep apnea. And ResMed obviously is currently kind of in the news for other reasons, because they're the ones that have had to pick up the slack after Philips have had some device recalls in the respiratory and sleep area. But this is positive news for ResMed as they continue to make their way in that space.
No, they've been really aggressive in sort of adopting new digital technologies and sort of patient connectivity tools. So seems like this is the latest example of that, and they're hitting their stride at the right time. All right, Danielle, we've got you here because you authored numbers 2 and 1. So let's start with number 2, Danielle. What's the news there?
The FDA granted breakthrough device designation for Abiomed's Impella ECP expandable percutaneous heart pump. Basically, it's one of the newest devices out of Abiomed's Impella collection of heart devices, and it's able to fit into a smaller vascular areas and is able to provide safer procedures for patients who need hemodynamic support for coronary revascularization. So I know the Impella line is making a lot of strides lately because it's the Impella RP right heart pump won pre-market approval in June. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and you wrote that the FDA granted breakthrough device designation based on a positive clinical data from the company's first 21 Impella ECP patients. So that's great that the designation comes after such a small sample. It seems as if the FDA is intent upon getting new technology out to patients.
Right.
All right. Well, let's roll into number one of this week's New Markers Newsmakers.
Yeah. Number one is the FDA approved Abbott's Amplatzer Amulet heart treatment device to treat AFib. And I've recently noticed that AFib treatment devices is kind of spiking. I've seen AFib has crossed our feeds multiple times a week. So, but the amulet is a left atrial appendage occluder that treats AFib in patients who are at risk of ischemic stroke. And it's a small pouch that's connected to the upper left chamber of the heart.
Well, great stuff. Great job with these articles and with bringing folks the news on a mass device. Before we go, Danielle, why don't we tell folks what life sciences pages do you work on in addition to mass device? Because you lead up a few of our other sites. I
lead medicaltubingandextrusion.com. It's a lot of catheter-based news and tubing news, as you can imagine. And then also I dabble in medical design and outsourcing. That's where I started here, but I've expanded.
Dabbler in MDO. And Sean, remind folks what pages you work.
So I do a lot of drug delivery business news. That's the one I've been working on mainly, but then mass device is what I started with, and then I'll contribute here and there to pretty much everything. But drug delivery and mass device are the main two.
Excellent. All right, now we'll continue our conversation about pulse field ablation. Next up, I want to bring in Rebecca Seidel. Rebecca Seidel is the president of Cardiac Ablation Solutions, and Dr. Robert Cowell. Robert Cowell is the vice president of medical affairs and CMO of cardiac rhythm and heart failure. They're both at Medtronic, and this is actually an excerpt of our Medtronic Talks podcast that we ran at the end of July. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, you can go to devicetalks.com. You can find it there, or you can subscribe. You can find the Medtronic Talks podcast. They come out about 2 or 3 times a month. You can find it on all major podcast channels, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, just as you can find Device Talks Weekly there. So subscribe to both of these podcasts. But before we begin this very short conversation with Rebecca Seidel and Robert Cowell, I want to bring in our sponsor, Paul Life Sciences. I spoke with Joseph Vickers. Joseph Vickers is the global portfolio leader for medical membranes and media at Paul Life Sciences. And we had a short visit to learn what Paul has been up to. Let's listen. Well, Joseph Vickers, thanks for joining us. Tell our listeners a bit more about Paul Corp and Paul Life Sciences.
Yeah, certainly. So Paul's split into 2 kind of subsections. We have Paul Industrial and then Paul Life Sciences. So the area I'm in is Paul Life Sciences, which is really a materials technology company at the heart. And then the core technology around that is microporous filtration membranes. We split ourselves into different business units so we can best serve our customers in each of those business units. So we have our biotech section, our laboratory section, and then the medical section, which is the part that I'm involved with. And then within that, we have a portfolio of medical membranes. So these are membranes that we manufacture, design, manufacture, and then offer for sale through our OEM channel. So we're providing the membranes as a component that's then integrated by our customers into primarily their medical devices.
All right, we'll hear more from Joseph Vickers just after this conversation with Rebecca Seidel and Robert Cowell. And just the final area I'd like to cover is just your work in the pulse field, Pulse Select. You've got some trials going on there. How important is it before we get into the details of that technology, to have sort of multiple approaches to treating AFib, and to have more, I guess, to have those extra shots on net? Is it necessary to have 2 or 3 or 4 different technologies to treat this disease?
I think it is. I think that as we look to the future, there will be opportunities for cryo, RF, and pulse field ablation in this space. The reason I say that is because there are multiple types of arrhythmias, and we've talked a lot about atrial fibrillation today, but there are other things like VT, SVT, and we think that there are certainly tools that can treat across that spectrum, both disease states and the technologies. And so I think it'll continue to be important for the long haul to have all 3.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the other piece is, as much as we know about doing pulmonary vein isolation, and again, the reason for treating early is because that's the pulmonary veins are the main sources early. When you get into later phases of AFib, it's less about the pulmonary veins. And we still have a lot to learn about the mechanisms, and to be able to bring to bear different types of energy sources depending on those mechanisms as we learn more is going to be really critical.
Well, that's great. Well, let's talk a bit about Pulse Select. Where are you with that, those trials and that technology?
So we're very excited about this technology. We've completed the pilot phase. It's a global trial, and we're moving into the pivotal phase at this point. We're about half enrolled in this trial, and we expect to finish the enrollment by the end of this calendar year. And so it's a paroxysmal and persistent, so a 2-arm study, 150 patients in each arm. And like I said, we're getting close to finishing the enrollment. It's a year follow-up, and then we'll have results at that point.
Great. And anything to add to that, Rob?
I know, just, I would say that, I was privy to this technology a long time ago, again, before I came to Medtronic, and share the same kind of excitement from what I described when we first started using the cryo balloon. I think this is one of those things that can, redefine how you go about ablation, not only from kind of the ease and effectiveness, but again, the safety factor. If you continue to make incremental improvements in safety, it just opens the door to how you can treat people.
All right, it's great to have Medtronic's point of view. And once again, you can get this entire conversation. It's about Medtronic's approach to atrial fibrillation, including its work on making Arctic Front a first-line treatment for atrial fibrillation. And now we're going to get back into our conversation with Joe Vickers from Paul Life Sciences. Joe, I'd like to learn a little more about medical membranes. How are they used in medical devices?
Yeah, no problem. So we split our offerings by different application. So we have 3 sections. We have our diagnostic membranes, which are used in various different ways for point-of-care diagnostic devices. So I guess the one that's closest to people's thoughts at the moment is the rapid COVID tests. There's membranes in there which are allowing that diagnostic to happen. Then we also have our liquid filtration membranes. So these are primarily used in drug delivery filtration. So if you have an intravenous drip, then there should be a filter on there to protect the patient from any air or particulate. And that's a hydrophilic filter membrane, so it lets the liquid pass through and retains any contaminants. And then the other section is our gas and vent membranes. So these are either for venting or for gas flow filtration, and they're hydrophobic or oleophobic membranes, most commonly used, again, in medical devices as the vent filter. So if the liquid stream is the drug that's going into the patient, the vent is there to make sure that the device can breathe, if you like, but it still maintains the sterility and make sure none of the drug is escaping through that section.
And finally, Joe, I understand that Paul is coming out with a new product. Please share some more details.
Yeah, so we have a new product launch. It's called our VersaPore RC. And this fits in that gas and vent application that we just discussed. So this is a oleophobic filter membrane for use as venting in those medical devices. And there's really kind of 3 3 points around this membrane, why it's a great membrane. The first one is the filtration performance. So I guess the most important. So it performs really well at making sure it has the high retention ratings to stop any contaminants getting into the stream. But then the other one, which is, really, really important, is it's a very robust membrane. So like I said earlier, we supply these membranes as a component for customers to integrate into their devices. So this is really easy to handle. It's very easy for them to use in manufacturing. It seals very well into their devices. It's not particularly staticky, so you don't end up with reels of membrane floating all around the room. And also it's not sided, so whichever way you want to put it into the device, it's going to work equally well in both directions. And then the final point, which is there's the PFOA regulations, which have come into place recently in Europe particularly, but we'll see those probably expand around the rest of the world. And this membrane's been developed to make sure that it's fully compliant in terms of the levels of PFOA and PFOA-related components that are involved in its manufacture.
All right, it's great to have Joe Vickers on the podcast. Once again, he's a global portfolio leader for medical membranes and media at Paul Life Sciences. If you want to find out more information about Paul Life Sciences and Paul Corp, go to paul.com. That's PALL.com. I enjoyed this upcoming conversation very much. I had a chance to speak with Ken Stein. Ken is the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at the CRM business at Boston Scientific. He really shares some great insights on why he became a CMO, what it means to him, what advice he gives to others who are considering a move from clinical to a corporation. And then, of course, we get into talking about Farapulse and Boston Scientific's other work in the areas. So let's begin this great conversation with Ken Stein of Boston Scientific. Ken Stein, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks a lot, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's going to be great to follow up and learn more about the Farapulse acquisition and talk more broadly about atrial fibrillation and where Boston Scientific is headed. And I do want to hit upon the Preventice acquisition as well. Lots to talk about. But as we always do, I'd like to find out a little bit more about our guests and allow our listeners to hear more as well. How did you come to join Boston Scientific in 2009? You were practicing at the time, correct? Take us back to 13 years now, and talk about that career change. I'm always fascinated by these points in time.
Sure, 13 years and one pandemic ago. I'm a cardiologist, cardiac electrophysiologist, and I was on faculty in New York City at Cornell, where I was associate director of the EP lab, and I had a lot of interactions with industry. Was running a major trial for Boston Scientific at the time, a trial called Smart AV. Honestly was very happy where I was at Cornell, but Boston was looking for a chief medical officer for rhythm management. And, when the opportunity arose, I sort of had a way off. I mean, I love taking care of patients. Mm-hmm. The issue though, when you're practicing medicine is you help patients serially, one at a time. And right. You can make a huge impact in people's lives, but you're limited to the people who you're taking care of at the moment. Whereas, in a position like this, the breadth of your impact is much larger. Now, you don't necessarily see the people that you're helping, so you lose the immediacy, but the decisions you make, and I always say for better or for worse, affect tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And so for me, I had achieved what I wanted in my career academically. I had no aspiration to become a chief of cardiology at any medical center. And so for me, it was the opportunity to have the kind of breadth of impact I think I have had through my career here is really what attracted me to make the change.
Are you practicing at all still? I know some folks like to practice 1 or 2 times a month.
No, this is really a 24/7 job in and of itself. And B, at least for the kind of medicine that I practiced, the conflicts of interest really just become too daunting too quickly. So I hadn't done any patient care, although for a while during the pandemic, I was actually volunteering at a vaccine site. So,
oh, really?
And that was that again. That was nice to just again be able to feel that you give back, and people were obviously always very happy when they were able to get the vaccine, particularly early on. So I felt a little bit of that immediate patient impact. But cool. Other than that, no, have not been able to keep on taking care of patients.
I'm guessing that you, from time to time, are asked advice from folks who are thinking about that switch, physicians who maybe want to move into industry for whatever reason, and I'm hoping you're not getting a lot more of those after the pandemic. But what sort of advice do you give to folks who are thinking about shifting to industry, and maybe what surprised you the most? What did you learn from that transition?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked a lot.
Sure.
What did you find? And I think, I'll try to say this as nicely as possible, is, that on the one hand, physicians are way too cynical about the motivations of folks in industry. Mm-hmm. People are in industry for the same reason that folks are in medicine. It's to help people. You wake up every morning and you know that your goal that day is to do something that's going to extend or improve the lives of patients. On the other hand, is also found that industry is way too cynical about the motivation of physicians. One of the early things when I got to Boston Scientific was the development of an extended longevity battery technology that basically doubled the longevity of our devices versus anything else that was out there on the market. And there were folks internally who were very worried. Well, in a fee-for-service environment, are physicians actually going to be willing to adopt this technology because it's going to reduce the number of pulse generator changes that they're going to do? And the answer is yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That became a very important differentiating feature for us. And so I think there were bad actors on both sides, but on the whole, folks on both sides want to do the right thing for patients. And that gets to, sort of the advice that I give to people, which honestly was the advice that I got when I took this job. I was interviewing and met at the time with Dr. Don Boehm, who was the global chief medical officer for Boston Scientific. And when he interviewed me for the role, the first thing he asked me, I hadn't even sat down. I was on my way into his office with one hand on the doorknob. And he said to me, Stein, you have no idea what a chief medical officer does, do you? And that's where you kind of think, am I going to try to BS my way through this or not? And I said, no, Dr. Bain, you're right, I don't. But what he said, and it is critically important to my decision to take the role, critically important to how I see myself in the role, and how I want other MDs who we hire to see themselves. And what he said is, your role is to be the voice of the patient mm-hmm. within Boston Scientific. And he went on, he said, you don't know anything about business. We know you don't know anything about business. We got a lot of MBAs here, and hopefully they do know something about business. but your role is to make sure that everything we do is directed at real needs for patients. That's
excellent, and that's I'm sure a great selling point for a physician to know that they're going to be able to advocate for the patients. It sounds like it is a big responsibility. I mean, what is that? How do you sort of keep that perspective as part of you and as part of your overall mission when you've sort of removed yourself from the healthcare process? Like, how do you keep that at front of mind, that you're always there for the patient?
Well, I think the key is that I don't see myself as removed from the healthcare process.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The patients who get our devices are my patients. In the same way, when I put in a Boston Scientific pacemaker in a patient, that was my patient. When I'm making the pacemaker that's going to that patient, they're still my patient.
That's a great point.
And so we all do, we look at these folks as, we're privileged to be able to be part of their care. We have a responsibility to make sure they get the best possible outcomes, and they are our patients for life.
That's great. That's a great point of view. So let's talk a bit about what you oversee at Boston Scientific. You're senior vice president there. You're chief medical officer for rhythm management. What technologies, what therapeutic areas fall under your responsibility?
Yeah. So by and large, we structure things on a franchise basis, and so within rhythm management, we have an electrophysiology franchise, which is our technologies for mapping ablation of cardiac arrhythmias. We have what we call our core cardiac rhythm management franchise, pacemakers, ICDs, and resynchronization therapy devices. And then we have a diagnostics and services franchise, which includes our Preventus acquisition, a company we acquired a few months ago, which does ambulatory ECG monitoring, and then our LuxDX implantable cardiac monitor, which was approved last year. And then beyond that, I also still do have a role. We took Watchman, which was the first approved left atrial appendage closure device, through acquisition integration with Boston, and then through the regulatory approval process. That now sits in another division within Boston Scientific, but I still do have a role in providing medical guidance for Watchman.
Wow, that is a lot. Well, let's talk about what brought us together, atrial fibrillation and Farapulse. First, give me a sort of if you would, a state of atrial fibrillation treatment as to what are the technologies available. If you want to focus only on Boston Scientific, that's understandable. But where are we with atrial fibrillation? Because Farapulse feels like to me it's the where we're going to be part of the question, which I'll ask next.
Yeah, we are very excited about the Farapulse acquisition. I'll talk a little bit, and again, the other disclosure that I need to make here, beyond having treated with patients atrial fibrillation and now working for a company that makes devices to treat AFib, I have AFib myself, and so have a very personal stake in and it really it's interesting how having it yourself, gives you a much better understanding of the emotional impact of the disease, on top of just sort of the intellectual facts that you know about it, having studied it or having cared for patients. AFib, first of all, right, it is an extraordinarily common arrhythmia. It's the most common sustained arrhythmia in adults in the developed world. It is one of the largest markets in medical technology today, and one of the fastest growing markets in medical technology today. What is clear today is that if you want to try to restore people to normal sinus rhythm, the best approach is to do a procedure called ablation, where you basically just destroy the abnormal tissue that's giving rise to the atrial fibrillation. Clear data that for patients with what's called paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, where atrial fibrillation starts and stops on its own, that this is far more effective than drug therapy. And accumulating data that although the success rates aren't as great, still can be highly successful, even in patients who've progressed to what's called persistent atrial fibrillation, where they go in it all the time. And the cornerstone of atrial fibrillation ablation is to ablate, basically destroy the tissue that's around where the four veins from the lungs, what are called the pulmonary veins, empty blood from the lungs into the upper left chamber of the heart. It's called the left atrium. And just by doing that, there are success rates that are probably in the range of 70 to 80% in terms of preventing recurrences of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. Now, up until now, the two technologies that have been used to do that kind of ablation have been either radiofrequency ablation, which actually uses heat to cauterize tissue around the veins, or cryoablation, where you use cold energy to freeze the tissue and damage the tissue around the veins. And within Boston Scientific, we have a very extensive portfolio of radiofrequency ablation catheters, including a recent approval, a very novel catheter called StablePoint in Europe, which has both force sensing in the tip, so you can tell, exactly how well opposed the catheter tip is to the tissue you're trying to ablate, as well as something called direct sense, where you can measure the electrical coupling that you have to the tissue. And then we also have a cryoablation catheter called Polar X, which is approved in Europe and which is undergoing its IDE clinical trial in the United States. But the thing that we're most excited about, and I always worry when I say that, it's like asking which of your children is your favorite. I love all my children equally, but
the products don't listen to the podcast, so don't worry, you won't hurt anyone's feelings.
But the most exciting is Farapulse, which is a completely novel energy source. And it's a non-thermal way of ablating the cardiac tissue. And they do something called pulse field ablation. It's sometimes also called irreversible electroporation. And it's an electrical waveform that is very selective for only damaging heart tissue. And so the promise of it is that it really reduces the risk of a lot of the non-cardiac complications that you can get with the other energy sources. And because it's safer, we also expect that the large-scale clinical trials will prove it out to be at least as effective and quite probably more effective than the energy sources. And then also it is a very quick procedure to do. So it's very efficient for physicians, and anytime you can get in and out of a procedure faster, that's better for patients as well. And so Farapulse has been at this for quite some time. Began as a company called Iowa Approach. We were very early investors in Iowa Approach, and we've been investors in Farapulse from the get-go, and then just actually a few weeks ago closed the deal to acquire and are in the process of integrating Farapulse. They are approved under CE mark in Europe already and are well underway in their U.S. pivotal trial.
Were you involved with or were you part of the due diligence when those early investments were made? How long have you been following the story?
Yeah, no, from day one, there was an electrophysiologist in Iowa, Steve Mickelsen, who had this sort of crazy idea that you could harness this energy source as a means of selectively ablating cardiac tissue. And we saw the promise from day one and have been investors in it from day one.
I love those ideas that sort of come out of I don't want to say left field, but they hadn't been thought of by others before. But once everyone sort of sees the concept, they see the promise. What was it about Steve and Iowa's approach that really sort of? What was the first thing that excited you about? Did you immediately see the promise? Was it something that you needed to be sold on? What was your sort of first impression?
Well, I'm going to say yes, immediately saw the promise, but also did need to be sold on it, right? Because there are a lot of things that are promising that don't all pan out.
Sure.
But I mean, the clear promise here was safety. That if you have an energy source that is myocardial selective, that is a game changer. There are complications with other ablation energies for atrial fibrillation are rare, but are potentially very serious. And anything that you can do to improve safety is going to be a winner. As long as you're at least as effective, as long as you're at least as efficient. And here, with promise of not just better safety, but better efficacy and more efficiency, that again, you really didn't need to be a genius to see that if you could deliver on all that, you're going to have something that would be game changer. But then, there is obviously all the due diligence that you need to do, and it is a long path.
Sure. Right,
from concept to then actually translating that concept into something that will be safe, that will be effective, that will be efficient, and that can be applied to humans.
Are you able to speak to why the acquisition was made now? Did something occur? Was it the CE mark? Was it enrolling patients? Was there a milestone that was met? or was it just a decision, sort of the consensus that now's the time that we bring this in-house?
Yeah, I think what I can say is, under the deal that we had with them, there were a set of milestones that would trigger the option to acquire, and looking at where they were progressing with those milestones, now was the time where it made sense to make the acquisition. There are always things that startup companies can do more nimbly and more quick than a large multinational like Boston Scientific. On the other hand, you get to a certain point, and there are things that you can do much more effectively as a large multinational in terms of scaling up manufacture, meeting commercial demand in Europe, in terms of scaling up clinical trial activities and getting to the end of the various pivotal clinical trials that are ongoing.
So you have the CE mark, you're moving, hopefully you're moving to try to secure FDA approval. You've got the clinical trials underway. How does this change the game in terms of how these patients are treated? If it's safer and it's as effective or more effective, I imagine then this means more patients who perhaps would have opted for pharmaceuticals will now have this as an option if the safety is increased. How does this change the treatment paradigm for these patients?
Well, I think it's exactly what you said. I think it's being able to pull patients who might not otherwise have been offered this as a treatment in earlier, improving the throughput, reduces just waiting list times. And we're used to talking about waiting lists in some countries other than the United States, but even the United States now, because just the limited number of labs that are doing these kinds of sophisticated ablations, there can be long waits before you can get scheduled for your procedure. So increased throughput. And then, I think I touched on it very briefly earlier. If we can bring the same kind of success rates to the treatment of persistent atrial fibrillation as we have now for the treatment of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, that also opens up a huge new referral pool of patients. And then the last thing I'd say is also bringing this type of technology, not just into the United States, not just into Western Europe, but enabling ablation procedures to be performed safely, quickly, effectively on a global basis.
And when you have the approval in the U.S., is this something that just fits neatly in the quote unquote bag of your current sales force and you're selling to the same physicians, or is there a different customer that you'll be targeting with this?
This fits perfectly into the bag of what we already offer. And as a platform, fits well in with our other platforms, our complex mapping and navigation with Rhythmia and our overall catheter portfolio.
And how, I just want to explore again the drug versus device sort of question. How do current technologies that you're offering compare to pharmaceutical treatment in that, are they a second or third option? Are they offered first option currently? Where is, and you might have explained this further, maybe I'm just asking you to expand on, where does Boston Scientific's treatments for atrial fibrillation come into play? When are they offered to patients?
Yeah, as of now, the ablation solutions, if you look, for instance, at the guideline recommendations, typically are for people who've failed some kind of a challenge with an antiarrhythmic drug. There's accumulating clinical evidence that suggests that even as first-line therapy, ablation is better than undergoing a drug trial. I think, at some point, the indications, the guidelines, the regulation is going to have to catch up to that. Outside of the U.S., still today, ablation is typically only offered as a second line, someone who's already failed the drug. But frankly, the drugs for rhythm control in atrial fibrillation are just so uniformly ineffective and have such a high risk of side effects that as we look towards the future, I think the future is one where ablation really becomes first-line therapy.
It is exciting. Excellent. And last area I wanted to talk about was, and you hit upon it earlier, Preventus. You folks acquired Preventus earlier this year. Tell us a bit about the acquisition, about the technology you brought in.
Yeah, let me do that. And it actually is in some ways very much part of our atrial fibrillation a category leadership strategy. In that, where we are now with Preventus is really the only company that can offer every technology physicians would need, from diagnosing atrial fibrillation all the way through to treating atrial fibrillation. And so, starting with Preventus, which offers ambulatory EKG monitoring, so Holter monitoring, short-term Holter, long-term, like 14-day Holter monitoring, and event monitors or mobile cardiac telemetry, through to our LuxDX implantable cardiac monitor, which can provide multiple years of EKG recording when implanted under the skin. Again, to our ablation portfolio, where we're the only company to be able to offer all three modalities for ablation, radiofrequency, cryoablation, and pulse field ablation now with Farapulse, and then through to Watchman with left atrial appendage closure for stroke prevention in patients with atrial fibrillation. And what Preventus, again, added to our armamentarium was that early diagnostic capability. That is great for us for a number of reasons. First, there are just the clear commercial synergies in having a sales force that's going out and now representing ambulatory EKG recording, as well as a sales force doing the implantable cardiac monitor or our typical CRM products. There are clear commercial synergies there. These types of studies are often the first entry point into either a device implant or an ablation. There are also R&D synergies. One of the things that was really attractive about Preventus is they have a very sophisticated AI, artificial intelligence capability. It's part of the secret sauce behind why they've been growing so quickly as an ambulatory ECG company. And that same kind of AI capability we think can be leveraged elsewhere within our portfolio.
That is great synergy, and you're right. It complements your other technologies very well. How does it fit to? It's an area that has hit upon some snags with reimbursement. Reimbursement has been cut for some of these tests, and I know it's impacting some companies that don't have as wide an offering as you do. We've talked with iRhythm on the podcast earlier. How is Boston Scientific sort of approaching the challenge to reimbursement? Is this just a technology that the reimbursement, obviously reimbursement's always important, but if you offer all the solutions to the problems that are identified, maybe you certainly can weather it better than someone who's just offering the diagnostic. But how do you see CMS's view of these tests? And is this something that Boston Scientific is going to be challenging as other companies are doing?
Yeah, I think, as you said, this is one area where breadth of portfolio is very helpful, and at least being able to weather some of the storm. Having said that, we think it's pretty clear that the reimbursement cut for long-term Holter undervalues that technology. There's a wealth of clinical trial data that gets to just how much more valuable, how much more information you get from a long-term Holter recording as opposed to standard, 24 to 48 hour Holter monitor. And clearly there's a lot more cost involved in both the technology designed to do those recordings and just being able to read those recordings and deal with that wealth of data effectively. So, we're confident that there's going to be some rectification of that decision. But again, one of the advantages of the Preventus approach, at least, is they're not just a long-term Holter company, and they do also bring the event monitor recording capability, the mobile cardiac telemeter capability, and the short-term Holter capability.
Excellent. Well, great clarity on that. Well, great conversation, Ken. I'm really excited myself, and I can say clearly that about the Farapulse acquisition. It's great. It's just great to see the ecosystem work. We have a smaller company developing an exciting technology and a larger company ready to carry it through. And I appreciate your joining us on the podcast and sharing your thoughts.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having me on.
All right, well, now's the time we tell folks how to reach us on social media. Danielle Kirsch, how can folks find you if they need a Barry the Groundhog update?
I'm on Twitter at Danielle_Kirsch, Kirsh, and I'm also on LinkedIn, same name, Danielle Kirsch.
It's convenient using your same name and all your social media accounts. And Sean Hooley, where can folks find you?
Similarly, same name on both accounts. On Twitter, it's Sean, Sean, Hooley, WHOOLEY, WTWH. That's my handle. Sean Hooley, WTWH, and then Sean Hooley on LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic. I'm on Twitter at MedTechTom. I'm on LinkedIn, Tom, SALEMI. So once again, please reach out to us. We'd love to be connected with you on those social media channels so you can get our latest news. We post our news up there as we can. And please do share this podcast. And when you do that, tag the three of us so we can follow your conversations. You can also, of course, reach out to Chris Newmarker, who will be back next week. Chris is on Twitter at Newmarker, as in a Newmarker, and he's also on LinkedIn, Chris Newmarker. So yes, please do share this. Please do subscribe. Please do leave a review. I don't usually ask people to do that, to leave a ranking or a review, but it is helpful. I don't usually ask it because people don't always do it, but what the heck? I can just ask, and then you folks can decide what you're going to do. But it does help other folks find the podcast. We're always interested in growing this audience. So share, subscribe, give us a ranking, do what you can. It's time for everyone to pitch in and help us out. But all right, well, that is a wrap. Tune in next week. We'll have another great episode of the Device Talks weekly podcast waiting for you.
Woo!